They crowned him the King of Africa, a force of nature, a warrior in motion, a miracle in boots. But in Paris, where his light first pierced through the fog of obscurity, they never built him a statue, not even a plaque, just silence. Before AC Milan, before the Ballon d'Or, before he became the only world-class footballer to walk the halls of presidential power, George Weah was the soul of Paris Saint-Germain. In the twilight between magic and marginalization, he carved open defenses and danced past prejudice. His goals weren't just goals, they were rebellions. And yet, in the very city he helped lift into European glory, his name was quietly erased from memory. He was a black man from Liberia, playing in a league still tethered to its colonial past. A striker whose brilliance often made people uncomfortable. A footballer too raw, too proud, too powerful to be domesticated by the French football establishment. Behind the cheers was a wall of indifference. Behind the victories, a whisper of resistance. Why wasn't he loved in Paris like he was feared across Europe? Why did the French media hesitate to embrace him, even as he led PSG to their greatest Champions League run in history? This is not the story of a Ballon d'Or winner. This is not the story of a president. This is the untold chapter of George Weah. The chapter where he set fire to Parisian nights, but was never allowed to call them home. In the early 1990s, Europe was on the cusp of a new footballing order. The walls between East and West had collapsed, the Champions League had just replaced the old European Cup, and globalization was seeping into the sport, not just through TV rights and commercial logos, but through players. Foreign players, black players, African players. Into this shifting landscape stepped George Mane Opong Ousmane Weah, a name as long as his journey from the dusty streets of Monrovia to the bright lights of Paris. Born in 1966 in Claratown, a poverty-stricken suburb of Liberia's capital, Weah's early life was a portrait of hardship. Raised by his grandmother, he didn't own a pair of proper boots until his late teens. He played barefoot on gravel pitches, dodging rocks and poverty with the same flair he would later use to glide past defenders. Weah's path to Europe began with a whisper. Claude Leroy, a French coach working in Cameroon, spotted him playing for Tonnerre Yaoundé and saw in him something feral, something sacred. A few phone calls later, Arsène Wenger, then at AS Monaco, took the gamble. Wenger wasn't just signing a player, he was signing a revolution. At Monaco, Weah was raw but electric. He had pace, power, a left foot that could detonate from anywhere, and a hunger shaped by years of silence and survival. He once said, "When I run with my whole life." And you could see it. There was no jog in his game, only sprints, ruptures, fury. But it wasn't until his 1992 transfer to Paris Saint-Germain that Weah truly became a phenomenon. PSG were in the process of reinventing themselves. Backed by Canal+, they were desperate to escape Marseille's shadow and become the face of French football in Europe. George Weah was their gamble, a black African striker as the spearhead of Parisian ambition. It was radical, it was risky, it was sublime. In his first season, Weah didn't just score goals, he scored poetry. He dragged PSG to the French Cup final, struck vital goals in European nights, and turned the Parc des Princes into a theater of roars. His style was unorthodox. Long, loping strides, sudden explosions, elastic turns that made defenders look like they were standing in wet cement. But even as he delivered, something was off. The French press often described him in terms laced with exoticism, wild, beast-like, raw power. Praised, yes, but never fully embraced. He wasn't intelligent like Cantona or elegant like Papin. Instead, he was spectacle, an object of fascination, not admiration. He once told a Liberian paper, "They love what I do, but not who I am." That tension between performance and personhood followed him everywhere. In a France still coming to terms with its post-colonial identity, Weah, a proud Liberian Muslim from West Africa, didn't fit the script. He refused to play the grateful immigrant. He spoke his mind. He didn't assimilate. And the more he succeeded, the more he seemed to agitate something invisible. Still, on the pitch, he was unstoppable. In the 1994-95 Champions League, George Weah tore through Europe. He scored against Bayern Munich, Dynamo Kiev, and Spartak Moscow, finishing as the tournament's top scorer. PSG, long ridiculed as a domestic project, made it to the semifinals. They didn't lift the trophy, but they'd made a statement. Yet, when the French Footballer of the Year awards were announced, Weah's name wasn't even shortlisted. The media hailed his goals, but seldom named him among the greats. PSG fans adored him, but the nation never quite did. It was then that AC Milan came knocking. Italy offered more than money. It offered respect. It offered a platform unshackled from colonial undertones. And for Weah, it offered something France never truly did: belonging. He would go on to win the Ballon d'Or in 1995, becoming the first and still only African to do so. But this isn't that story. This is the story of a man who made PSG matter in Europe, yet was denied his place in their pantheon. A story of a footballer whose genius disrupted more than defenses. It disrupted narratives. It forced a country to confront its reflection, and many turned away. And as George Weah left Paris for Milan, no parade was held, no mural painted, just a quiet transfer and a legacy that France refused to honor until decades too late. George Weah didn't rise, he erupted. When he arrived in Paris in 1992, PSG was a club yearning for identity. Marseille had just won the European Cup, and the capital's team was seen as style without substance, flash without fire. But Weah brought something raw, not just goals, but gravity. Every time he touched the ball, the air thickened. Opponents tensed, fans leaned forward. His debut season was electric. In Ligue 1, he scored with a swagger that belied his humble beginnings. But it was on European nights that he became a different creature, possessed, untamed. The 1994-95 Champions League group stage is now etched in history because of him. Against Bayern Munich, he scored a solo goal that defied logic, picking up the ball near midfield, weaving past defenders like whispers, before slipping it under the keeper with ice in his veins. It was the kind of goal that doesn't just win games, it wins souls. By the spring of 1995, Weah was the tournament's top scorer. PSG had reached the semi-finals. It should have been the moment Paris fell at his feet. But something began to shift. The murmurs started subtly. A few French pundits questioned his decision-making. Others called him brilliant but undisciplined. After a narrow defeat to AC Milan in the semi-finals, a match in which Weah was double-marked, kicked, and suffocated, the criticism turned sharper. Too individual, not a team player, too emotional. The same traits that were lauded as fire became framed as flaws. And then came the whispers. Did George Weah have an attitude problem? That summer, as the club looked ahead, internal discussions at PSG began to lean toward building around more marketable figures. Weah, despite his Champions League heroics, was seen as unpredictable, difficult to mold. The club, under Canal Plus's influence, wanted stars that sold shirts, not questions. Behind closed doors, there were even reports of tension with a few teammates, not over performance, but over status. The cracks deepened when the French press began amplifying subtle racially coded critiques. Words like primitive strength crept into columns. Radio debates questioned whether PSG should move on from the Liberian, citing better tactical fits. For a man who had carried the club through Europe, it was a slow betrayal. Then came the ugly moment that no one forgets, though few speak of it. In late 1995, during a match between PSG and Bastia, Weah was racially abused on the field by Bastia defender Jean-Jacques Idali. Weah later confronted and punched him after the game. Though Idali was later found to have used racial slurs, it was Weah who was punished harshly by the league, suspended, fined, and publicly shamed. The media dissected his reaction but glossed over the provocation. That incident marked a turning point. Weah began to distance himself emotionally from France. He later told an Italian magazine, "You give your soul to a city, and they give you silence in return." His decision to leave for AC Milan came not out of ambition, but exhaustion. And in Italy, the fall reversed. At San Siro, he was embraced, respected, admired. He won Serie A. He scored perhaps the most iconic goal of his career, that full-pitch solo run against Verona, and he became, in December 1995, the first African to win the Ballon d'Or. But the moment was bittersweet. France had not celebrated him. PSG did not even post a farewell message. His Ballon d'Or was an Italian triumph, not a Parisian one. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the media quickly shifted focus. New signings were hyped. The memory of Weah began to fade from headlines. No retrospective, no tribute. The fall wasn't on the pitch. It was in the hearts of those who chose to look away from what they had. And George Weah, for all his grace, never forgot that silence. There is a photograph, grainy, almost forgotten, of George Weah walking alone into the tunnel at the Parc des Princes. The crowd still roars behind him, but his shoulders are hunched, his head bowed. It was a win. He'd scored. But there was no joy on his face. Just a kind of silence that only Exile understands. Because beneath the surface of George Weah's dazzling run in Paris was a truth that rarely made the papers. He was never meant to belong. In locker rooms, some teammates kept their distance. Not because of ego, but because of his origins. He was not a product of Clairefontaine. He didn't rise through Cannes or Auxerre. He came from Monrovia. And for a footballing elite that still saw African talent as temporary, as trade goods, Weah was too loud, too proud, too permanent. He refused to play the grateful guest. Weah had a temper. That much is true. But it wasn't the tantrum of a prima donna. It was the fury of a man who had survived war-torn streets and buried childhood friends under rubble. In Paris, he found luxury, yes, but also a subtler cruelty, the kind that smiles to your face while writing you out of the script. He once said in a private interview, "I was scoring for them, but I never felt they were cheering for me." The press? They wrote of his power, his sprints, his savagery, rarely his mind, never his soul. When he bought a house in the suburbs and began funding Liberian youth academies with his salary, the media scoffed. One outlet ran a headline, "Weah plays to the village." They didn't know or didn't care that the village he was funding had no electricity until he paid for it, that he was sending home not just money, but pride, that he'd become more than a player. He was a movement, but France didn't want a movement. It wanted a show. The Bastia incident scarred him. Racist chants had echoed from the stands. He reported them. No one acted. So when he punched idly, it wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of being unheard. And when the league punished him, not the man who provoked him, Weah's disillusion was complete. In private, he told a teammate, "I fight on the pitch, I fight off it, but I'm tired of fighting alone." In Italy, they at least let him breathe. But even his Ballon d'Or win couldn't erase the weight he carried from Paris. He once described it as a wound that healed over, but never closed. The day he held the golden trophy, standing next to Franco Baresi and Paolo Maldini, he looked into the camera and said, "This is for Africa. Not for France, not for PSG, Africa." Because that was the dark truth. George Weah had never played for a club. He had always played for a continent. And that truth made people nervous. Even years later, when PSG celebrated its legends, his name was missing. The club erected murals of Pauleta, Ronaldinho, Rai, but not Weah, a player who scored 55 goals in 138 games, who dragged them into Europe's elite, who turned night after night into fire. No plaque, no tribute, not even a jersey on display in the club museum for over a decade. It wasn't just an oversight, it was erasure. Some say it was politics. Others say it was racism dressed in professionalism. But whatever the reason, it hurt, because George Weah was never looking for glory. He was looking for respect. He found it not in the city where he gave everything, but in the streets of Monrovia, where kids still shout his name across sandlots. And in the end, that might have been enough. But it shouldn't have had to be. We tell ourselves that football is meritocratic, that if you're good enough, fast enough, brilliant enough, you'll be celebrated. But the story of George Weah in Paris quietly dismantles that illusion. How do you become a club legend when the club never wanted you to be more than a moment? How do you carry a city's dreams only to be left off its walls? At Hall of Legends, we're not interested in just the goals or the trophies. We look deeper into what the world refused to see. And in George Weah's case, what we see is a genius eclipsed by an institution that never fully embraced him. He wasn't just a forward, he was a force. A man whose very presence challenged the unspoken boundaries of identity in European football. He was African, unapologetically so, not just in origin, but in posture, pride, rhythm. And perhaps that's where the discomfort lay. His time at PSG is not a football tale. It's a socio-political parable. Because here was a man doing everything right, scoring, winning, elevating. And yet the narrative around him was controlled, constrained. He was mythologized for his athleticism, but rarely humanized. He was praised as a phenomenon, but seldom respected as a man. The silence of French football in the face of his contributions is louder than any chant. We can't ignore that race, class, and post-colonial unease played roles here. Weah wasn't just breaking lines on the pitch, he was breaking expectations. And for a system built to reward a certain kind of conformity, that made him dangerous. So we must ask, was George Weah a wasted genius in France, or a truth too raw for its comfort zone? Did he truly fall out of favor, or did France simply fail to rise to his level? Perhaps the tragedy isn't that he left. Perhaps it's that no one asked him to stay. Because in football, as in history, it's not just who plays, it's who gets remembered. And sometimes, erasure is more violent than defeat. We believe George Weah's story in Paris is not just a football story. It's a reminder that legends are not only made by what they do, but by what the world chooses to do with them. Nostalgia and legacy. Today, when we speak of George Weah, the world remembers the Ballon d'Or, the thunderous goals at AC Milan, the full-pitch sprint against Verona, the statesman in a suit standing before the people of Liberia as their elected president, the first and only footballer to hold such a role. But in Paris, something quieter lingers. Not statues, not chants, but a ghost. A presence that once lit up the Parc des Princes and now drifts unspoken through its halls. For those who truly watched him play there, the memory is unshakable. The impossible angles, the sheer violence of his acceleration, the nights he made defenders look like tourists in his storm. There are no murals of George Weah in the PSG museum, but there are echoes. In every African player who's worn that shirt since, from JJ Okocha to Achraf Hakimi, there's a trace of the path he carved with blood, brilliance, and bruises. Weah didn't just play for PSG, he made PSG matter. Before the Qatari billions, before Neymar and Mbappé, before global rebranding, there was George, running, fighting, winning, alone. Perhaps that's his true legacy. Not the goals, not the trophies, but the quiet revolution he started simply by existing where no one believed he should. He was never just a forward. He was a mirror. And France wasn't ready to look. But time, like football, always moves forward. And now, finally, the story is being told, not with fanfare, but with reverence, with the honesty it always deserved. Because legends are not just what we celebrate, they're what we regret. And George Weah, in all his fire and silence, is both. Some stories were never meant to be told. But now, you know.